This time on Poll Hub, Republicans, well, some Republicans, are once again threatening to shut down the government if they don't get their way. If it happens, it won't be the first time, and if the past is any guide, Republicans are likely to be blamed by a majority of Americans. So why, GOP? Why? Then, we know Americans are getting married, buying houses, and having kids later than they used to. But they're also saying, I do, far less often, period. What's behind that decline? And is your life more Fast and Furious or When Harry Met Sally? That's the gist of our fun fact, and hopefully it will lead this episode to a happy ending. Let's get started so we can find out. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Mary Griffith.
And I am Lee Maringal.
Shut it down, shut it down, shut it down. Lee, I gotta say that shutting down the government does bring back memories, for me anyway, and I think it probably does for you, because the first big government shutdown of the modern era was during Bill Clinton. Newt Gingrich was the Speaker of the House. I was a political reporter. It was a big deal. And it didn't go the way I think a lot of people, especially on the Republican side, thought that it would go. And now we're back in the position of yet another threat of a shutdown. What's your read on this?
I think it's really playing with political dynamite. We've seen that in the earlier shutdowns. I think there's a confusion. People will sometimes think, shut the government down in the abstract sort of appeals to them until they start finding out that people aren't getting paid, the Social Security checks could be delayed. The government is literally shut down despite their desire to, government's too big or government's dysfunctional. The idea of shutting it down sort of crosses a line for a lot of people. And I think in the previous times, during the Obama years and the Clinton years before that, I think the Republicans paid a price for that because they're identified more with closing government down. And then people start to think, gee, this really isn't a solution. And unless something specifically is gained, they figure, well, eventually it'll open anyway. And there'll be like a negotiation and something. So let's not go down this road, which we avoided with a continuing resolution several months back, which got us to this point. So delay, and you end up here eventually. And it's a plague on both their houses to some degree, but I think that...
But it's always been a plague on the Republican House, really. So in Clinton and Obama and even Trump. Remember, the last shutdown was Trump. Democrats were in the House. Yeah. So the shoe was kind of on the other foot. And the Republicans got blamed for that one.
Yeah, so it didn't matter that it was Congress. In that case, it was a Republican in the White House. So it doesn't have to do just with Congress.
So let me jump in with some numbers from CNN USA Today Gallup poll that was taken as the shutdown began in the 1990s. At that point, 40% of Americans said that the shutdown was a major problem. 33% thought it was a minor problem. So here we have more than 7 in 10 Americans at that time thinking that it was problematic. And 11% of Americans actually called it a crisis, with only 14% saying it was not a problem at all. And Republicans, Jay, as you pointed out, generally got the blame. And some say Clinton was reelected partially as a result. So in terms of public opinion, as we've approached and taken a look at the other two more recent government shutdowns, Jay, how has public opinion changed in this area?
Yeah, I mean, it has and it hasn't. I think, Lee, what you alluded to is that the Republican Party, when the first shutdown happened, was very much the party of we need to rein in the government. Mm-hmm. And I think what's changed is that we now have a party where the Republicans are fighting among themselves, which is why a shutdown would happen, with one wing of the party, which is not really about the government, needs to be reined in. It's, I need to say something to get on Fox News. And that's their only motive. That's the only reason they exist. And then the rest of the Republican Party, which is like, well, yeah, we should reduce the deficit, but we can't even have a conversation with these other people in the party. And I think we haven't seen much polling around this yet. That generally doesn't happen until there's a shutdown and then you see it. But, if past is prologue, the people pulling the trigger, and in the case of Trump, he was perceived to have pulled the trigger in 2019. Mm-hmm. It's the person or the people who are pulling the trigger on the shutdown who get the blame. And the Democrats haven't used this tactic. And in this case, it's hard for me to see, even with the extreme polarization we've seen, with the shift in who Republicans, self-identified Republicans really are. They're very different from Republicans self-identified in 1995 during that shutdown. But even with that shift, I find it really hard to believe that we're going to see polling that comes out if there's a shutdown where the Democrats are blamed in this case. Maybe I'm wrong, but it just doesn't seem like that's likely to happen.
Although I do think that there is a somewhat of a danger spot for the Democrats. Let's just play this one out a little bit. So most of the Republicans go with the speaker, but then there's a few who maybe don't. And then what happens if a more moderate wing of the Republicans kind of combine with the Democrats to reopen it? And where does that put the Democrats in the relationship with Speaker McCarthy? Obviously Republican. I think that's a little double-edged. You have to sort of be careful how I know we're running ahead on the script, but how do we undo this? How do we get out of this? And who ends up with at least some kind of moral victory looking ahead to the election cycle?
That's some three-dimensional chess you're playing here.
Yeah. It gets
I thought you didn't believe in crystal balls, Lee.
Well, in this case, it's being gamed out because in Washington, what are these congressmen thinking? Well, we're up for election. It's going to be a presidential year. Turnout tends to run higher. There's obviously going to be some swing districts that are being targeted. The Democrats are going to hope to get back the House, and it only takes a handful of seats to do that. So I really think there's a lot of gamesmanship going on, and that's a danger for both sides. Who looks serious and who looks wanting to resolve it versus who's playing it out.
So, Lee, at the beginning of the segment, you started talking about Americans' perceptions of a government shutdown. It almost seems as though there's always some talk of a possibility of a government shutdown and averting a government shutdown. And when we look ahead to the election, I mean, is this really an issue that voters are going to care about in light of other issues that are in the political discourse?
It's probably going to be only one which underscores what are the parties all about and what do they mean. I think rather than, let's just say it's a 3-week shutdown. No, they're not going to be thinking a year from now, but it does underscore who's working to move the process along and who's on the side of government paralysis. Because as Jay indicated, there was an ideological component early on. Government gotten out of control. And now you've got so many factions, each with their own case to make. The Democrats have some risk here, but clearly I think it's going to rest with the Republicans in the House in terms of their inability to get it together with a unified message. So the chaos, I think, is going to look ultimately on their side.
I think vis-a-vis elections, the shutdowns have always, as you just said, Lee, underscored a narrative. They've either supported or cut back on a narrative that a party is building. And in the 90s, Gingrich had come in, Republicans had taken control of the House for the first time in a generation. It was a huge turning point, and that was widely seen, along with the Clinton impeachment, to be an overplaying of the hands by Republicans. It underscored a narrative Democrats were trying to lay in, that these folks were a little too. They were a little out of control. In the Obama shutdown, Obama seemed like Cool Hand Luke. He was not up for re-election. Remember, he had already won a second term, and it didn't really impact 2014. I think in Trump's case, it underscored the narrative that Trump wasn't, at least among those who believed it, Trump wasn't a serious government person. He wasn't somebody who really had the interest of running the government. And so he would just do anything. And he did that, and that underscored that narrative. That's what I wonder here, though, and that's kind of what you're getting at, Lee, is the narrative that this underscores that the Republicans are completely dysfunctional and incapable of running a house of government, or at least the House, Congress. Or does it underscore the idea that things are so broken, we need people to finish breaking it? You got to blow the whole thing up and start.
Do you think any of this, Mary or Jay, do you think any of this relates to a perception right now, which seems to be forming, that the Republicans are looking to launch an impeachment against Joe Biden, but they're not quite sure why, and they're not quite sure the connection? If you're now the party of the unclear cause for impeachment and the unreasonable shutdown of the government, aren't you starting to form a narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what, that's the narrative that I believe Democrats, obviously, along with the abortion issue, but that's the narrative that Democrats want to play. And it is hard to see, especially with fairly conservative Republicans saying this is an incredibly dumb idea, including some leaders and founders of the most conservative caucuses within the Republican Party in the House. They're saying this publicly. You got to think there's probably some truth to that in there.
Yeah. And I would just add one quick sentence is, let's think about Speaker McCarthy and just how weak he is and how this is reflective of his inability to kind of...
Well, Lee, a caution here. We're recording on Thursday at 3 p.m. in the East. By the time this airs, he might not be speaker. It's always possible. So.
Well, all right. Well, this is maybe a little bit of a hard transition, but we're posing the question in our next segment. Are Americans not marriage material? Now, we're not going to analyze individual Americans. It's about their acceptability as a life partner. But we are going to talk about the rate of marriage here in the United States. And it has declined. It has more than halved in more than 50 years. So in 1970, the marriage rate in the United States was 76.5%. Now it stands at 31%. So that's a pretty steep drop here. But let's dig down here. When it comes to the value of marriage and whether or not the declining rate of marriages is a good or a bad thing, white evangelical Christians are more likely to say that the decline is a negative. So what's really driving this decline in the marriage rate? Well, there are some numbers pertaining to that as well. More than 7 in 10 Americans say that having a job or career that they enjoy is extremely or very important to having a good life. And they put this in front of having close friends, 61%, children, 26%, having a lot of money, 24%, and being married, 23%. So do you think this is just a shift in priorities, or do you think there's something else going on?
Lee, you've been married the longest amongst us. So.
Thanks. So yeah, I'll be clocking the big 50 next year. Yeah, thank you very much. There's a lot of applause going on here in the Zoom that we're looking at. But look, I think a lot of things are going on. A lot of obvious societal changes having to do with the gender and the workplace. That's not a new theme, but it's certainly carried on. I think also a lot of younger folks, just in terms of the ability to get out on their own and establish themselves. We hear more and more about people who are still living at home because they haven't, gotten to the point where they feel secure enough to move in the marriage direction. And I think also a lot of couples don't necessarily see that traditional step as being a vital part of what their lives are going to be, because they can, live together or whatever and move ahead from that vantage point. So I think there's a lot of things here coming together to affect this trend. I mean, you just have a lot of single parents right now, and you have a lot of unmarried couples, and you have all kinds of just combinations filling up these numbers that make for the trend.
I'm reminded of a poll hub that we did not that long ago with a professor from University of California, Santa Barbara, who was a singleism person. She's an expert in singleism. I don't remember the exact title. And what was interesting about that was that she was talking about people being happy being single and the pressure that there is of society to get married and not to be single. A little different because she was talking about coupling as well as marriage, but a little bit different. But it strikes me as interesting that there has been these trends that she talked about that it's becoming more acceptable, that there's the economic forces behind it. There's all kinds of things. But in a poll from the University of Michigan, they asked in 1976, they asked high school seniors, do you expect to get married? 74% said yes in 1976. They asked in 2020, 71% said yes. So while there has been this really dramatic decline over this period in the number of people married, high school seniors, there's really no change. Over 30 or 40 or 50 years here, there's really no change in the number or the percentage of high school seniors who expect to get married. I'm wondering, is the expectation still there, but the reality of doing it so much harder? Or I don't know, Mary, where does that fit in what you see and what you think?
Yeah, I think that there's this expectation that young people do want to get married. They expect to get married. That is something that they want to experience. They see value in it. But I think that for them, there's not necessarily the rush that there was perhaps 30, 40, 50 years ago. There are young people now see that they can support themselves, as Lee indicated earlier, without getting married. There's less stigma surrounding adoption or having a child without being married. So the societal norms have changed. I think that young people do see themselves as ultimately entering into marriage. But I think that they want to live life a little bit before they take that step and get married. So I'm looking at a statistic here that shows that the number of women who are entering their first marriage between the ages of 40 and 58 has gone up 75% since 1990. And that's huge when you think about it, that there's no rush to get married, that there's no societal expectation for women, that has certainly changed over the past 3 or 4 decades. And that there are reasons that, the personal reasons that there's less of an economic need. And I really do think, especially in recent years with the post-pandemic era, that people want to live their lives and they want to enjoy their lives, and that they'll get there when they get there.
Yeah. Although people see the declining rates of marriage, as you indicated, as being more of a negative than a positive. And I think also we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about and I don't have the figures on this, the increase in same-sex marriages, which has become obviously part of our society in a very significant way and affecting a lot of people and kind of going against some of these trend numbers, but obviously not so much that it's reversed them and the pattern still goes in the same direction. I don't know what the
Gallup,
numbers are.
Yeah, I have those. Gallup's been asking that question since 2015. Remember, the legal same-sex marriage nationally was just before that. And it's basically held steady, 8% in 2015 when they first asked. It's 10% now in 2022 or last year of LGBTQ adults are married in a same-sex relationship. So I think there was at the time, I got married at that time, even though I never thought I would get married nor intended to. We did because it was New York State passed it and it wasn't national yet. It wasn't federal. And we were like, well, we're going to get married because if the Supreme Court decides that you can't get married, we'll at least be married. We'll have a leg to stand on, right? We'll have a fight to be able to make. And I think a lot of same-sex couples got married in that period. But now it's staying at a static 10%. So there has been an increase in terms of the absolute numbers. But these statistics suggest that same-sex couples aren't all that much different in that regard than everybody else.
You know what, Lee? This marriage is portrayed in different ways in movies, don't you think?
Movies, I might say, and I think you were tossing me a soft segue, was into our fun fact there. CBS News had asked in 2012, roughly 10 years ago, if your life was a movie, what kind of movie would it be? An action-adventure movie, a comedy? I'm sorry, if your life was a movie, would it be an action-adventure movie, a comedy, a romance, a tragedy, or a perplexing, low-budget independent film? Which I kind of like myself. So I'm not sure. Well, I'll give you some national numbers on this. So what CBS found about a decade, 35% of plurality said their life would be a comedy. I'm not quite sure what they had in mind on that. 22%, the next largest group, saw their life as being kind of an action-adventure film. And then the next group went to a perplexing, low-budget indie film. And then that was at 19%. 12% think their movie about their lives would be a romance, 7% a tragedy. And that figure isn't any higher. And I didn't know exactly where I fit in on all this.
What are you? Has your life been an action?
I'm not sure what an action adventure movie is. I don't think my life would be that. I sort of leaned towards the perplexing, low budget independent film.
Why does that not surprise me? Why does that not surprise me?
If I had to write the story of my life, I think it would be kind of like perplexingly complex. I don't think I fit in any single box.
The opening scene of your life movie is actually is perfect for perplexing, low budget indie. It's Woodstock going on, and you're in the library going, "What's that all about? What's all this noise about?" I think that's a great start.
Living in the Hudson Valley that summer and going back to college and being asked, "Did I go to Woodstock?" and having to answer, "What about Woodstock?" is probably a good opening scene to a very perplexing, low budget indie. Okay, where are you guys on this? So
Mary, what are you? Comedy, action adventure with your kids? Action adventure?
Yeah, well, action adventure is definitely possible with my kids, but I would say comedy with my children. If you could see the scene at night with my 3 kids and then a terrible 2 running around between my legs as I'm trying to do other stuff, you would think it's a comedy. But I've always seen the comedic aspect of Bridget Jones in my life. Not necessarily the romantic piece of that, but the falling into different situations. And yeah, I would say my life is a comedy.
So my favorite movies are not any of these. They're the ones that mix them all. Like rom-com action movies are awesome, right? Action comedy movies, which are most of the, superhero movies now, are great. And low budget indie comedies or action, those are good too. So I feel like I'm a mix of all of these things, which is a cheap way out. But I do want to point out that once again, we have tapped our favorite group of pollsters at CBS News 60 Minutes Vanity Fair, the people who have brought us so many bizarre polls. And this one, I have to give them credit. I think they actually gave options that were fairly straightforward because in the past, some of them have been just bizarre.
Yeah, but they did indeed fit. So that is where we end with a good fun fact. Until next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Ethan Hollis.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review. Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcast app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.
Just like a movie star, how beautiful you are, just like a movie star.